Elena Voss had built an empire out of sheer will. By 34, she ran one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, a woman who walked into boardrooms like she owned the air in them, because in every way that mattered, she did. She slept 4 hours a night and called it discipline. She trusted numbers, not people, and she had never once in her adult life asked anyone for help. The night of the accident, she was driving home from a product launch that had gone better than anyone predicted. Rain slicked the road. A truck ran a light. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound, a metal scream that didn't feel like it belonged to her car, and then nothing, a long gray nothing that swallowed hours. She woke up in a hospital bed under lights, so white they felt like an accusation. Machines beeped in a rhythm that wasn't hers. A team of doctors stood at the foot of her bed, the way people stand when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. The lead specialist, a composed, graying man named Dr. Whitfield, was the one who finally spoke. He told her about the T4 vertebra, about the spinal cord, about the word complete, which in this context meant total, meant permanent, meant the leg she had used to run marathons and pace stages during keynote speeches would not carry her again. There's no feeling below the injury, he said gently. No movement. I wish I had a different answer for you. Elena didn't cry. She didn't rage, not then. She simply nodded once, the same nod she gave to a bad quarterly report, filed the information away, and stared at the ceiling until the room emptied. It was the calm that scared the nurses more than tears would have. Priya visited every day that first week, bringing contracts that needed her signature, updates from the board, small comforts she thought might help. Elena signed what needed signing and waved away everything else. She didn't want flowers. She didn't want the get-well cards from investors who had never once asked her to coffee before the accident and now suddenly cared very much about her recovery. She wanted, more than anything, to wake up and discover the whole thing had been an elaborate misunderstanding, a data error, a bad dream she could correct with enough willpower. Willpower, it turned out, meant nothing here. She could out-negotiate anyone in the industry, could outwork every competitor who'd ever underestimated her, and none of it moved her legs an inch. The realization settled into her slowly, over the weeks of rehabilitation, less like a single blow and more like water, finding every crack in a wall she hadn't known was already failing. Months slid by in a blur of hospital transfers and rehabilitation centers, and finally home, if the word home still applied, to the enormous glass and steel house on the hill that had once been a trophy and was now something closer to a cage. Elena had it retrofitted with ramps and rails and a hydraulic lift disguised as elegant architecture, all of it engineered to hide the fact that she needed any of it at all. She fired the first caregiver after 4 days for reorganizing her kitchen. She fired the second after a week for speaking to her like she was fragile. The third lasted 2 days. Elena told him she'd rather rot in this chair alone than be handled like a piece of broken furniture. Word got around in caregiving circles. Nobody wanted the job anymore. Her assistant, a patient woman named Priya, began quietly padding the pay to absurd numbers just to get anyone through the door. The house itself became a kind of confession, all that money spent hiding the one thing money couldn't fix. Elena had architects widen doorways and lower counters and disguise every accommodation as a design choice, refusing to let the house look like it belonged to someone who needed help. Visitors who didn't know better complimented the sleek, minimalist ramps winding through the property, never guessing they cost more than most people's homes and existed for a single, unspoken reason. She let them believe it was taste. It was easier than the truth. At night, when the house was empty except for whichever caregiver hadn't yet quit, Elena would wheel herself to the window overlooking the city she used to own a piece of and watch the lights of buildings she'd once walked into as an equal, now impossibly far away, both physically and in every other sense that mattered. That was how Jonah Reyes found the listing. Jonah had been out of steady work for 3 months, ever since the physical therapy clinic where he worked had closed its doors for good. He wasn't a licensed therapist, not officially. He'd spent 6 years as a combat medic before that, and after his service, he'd drifted into sports rehab work, learning the trade hands-on from an old mentor who cared more about results than paperwork. He knew bodies the way some men know engines, by feel, by instinct, by the small signs most people missed. None of that mattered to a hiring system that wanted certifications he didn't have. What mattered in the end was a 6-year-old named Mia asleep on a mattress on the floor of a motel room, and a bank account with $11 left in it. Mia's mother had left 2 winters ago, and Jonah had built his entire life since then around the simple, unglamorous work of showing up. School drop-offs, packed lunches with the crust cut off because Mia insisted crusts were an insult to good bread, a steady paycheck that never quite stretched as far as it needed to, no matter how carefully he budgeted it. He had applied to 11 other jobs before this one and heard nothing back from any of them. The caregiving listing, posted at triple the normal rate because no agency could keep anyone in the position, was either a miracle or a trap, and Jonah was too tired and too broke to care which. He showed up to the interview in his one good shirt, ironed crooked, and sat across from Priya in a kitchen bigger than his entire apartment had been. "She's fired the last 3, Priya warned him. "She will try to make you quit. Most people don't last a week." "I don't quit," Jonah said. "I've got a kid depending on me. Quitting isn't in the budget." Priya studied him for a long moment, then nodded and led him upstairs. Elena was in her wheelchair by the window when he walked in, backlit by the gray afternoon, arms crossed like a queen holding court in a room she never asked to rule. She looked him up and down with a flat, assessing gaze she used to save for underperforming vice presidents. "You're not a nurse," she said. "No, you're not a physical therapist. Not on paper. Then what exactly qualifies you to be in my house?" Jonah didn't flinch. "I've put broken men back together in worse conditions than this one. I don't do pity, and I don't do quitting. You can fire me if you want. I've been fired by scarier people than you." Something flickered behind Elena's eyes, something that might have been surprise, might have been the first real spark of interest she'd felt in months. "We'll see about that," she said, but she didn't fire him. Not that day. The first weeks were a war of attrition. Elena tested him constantly, snapping orders, needling him about his lack of credentials, trying to find the crack that would send him running like the others. Jonah refused to bend. When she demanded he speak to her more carefully, he told her plainly that careful was another word for scared, and he wasn't going to tiptoe around a grown woman just because her legs didn't work anymore. "You think you understand what I've lost," she snapped at him one afternoon, furious that he'd pushed her through another round of range of motion exercises she hadn't asked for. "No," Jonah said, not backing down. "I don't know what it's like to lose your legs, but I know what it's like to lose everything that made you feel like yourself, and I know that sitting in the dark feeling sorry for it doesn't bring any of it back." Elena turned away from him, jaw tight, and said nothing. But that night, for the first time since the accident, she didn't ask Priya to cancel the next day's session. There were other battles, too, smaller ones that mattered more than they should have. Elena insisted on doing her own transfers from bed to chair, refusing his hands, even when she fumbled and nearly fell, gritting her teeth through the effort rather than admit she needed steadying. Jonah let her fail twice before stepping on the third, not because he'd given up on her independence, but because he'd learned in the field that there was a difference between letting someone struggle towards strength and letting them get hurt out of pride. Elena hated that he could tell the difference. She hated more that he was usually right. She tested him in pettier ways too, ordering him to fetch things clearly within her own reach, watching to see if he'd refuse. He always did, calmly, without making it a lecture, simply nudging the item an inch closer and telling her she had 2 working arms and no excuse. Priya, watching from the doorway more than once, began to suspect that Jonah Reyes was either the bravest man she'd ever hired or the most foolish, and possibly both at once. It was during one of those sessions, weeks later, that Jonah noticed something the doctors had written off as involuntary reflex. A small twitch, a flicker in the muscle of her left thigh, responding faintly to a specific angle of pressure. He'd seen something like it before, in a fellow soldier who everyone had assumed would never walk again. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was a thread, and Jonah had never in his life been able to leave a thread unpulled. "I want to try something," he told her. "It's not standard. It's not going to be gentle, and your doctors are going to hate it. Elena raised an eyebrow, the closest thing to amusement she'd shown in months. My doctors already hate you. Then we're consistent, he said. You in? She looked at him for a long moment, the wheelchair suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a starting line. I have nothing left to lose, she said quietly. Let's see what you've got. The regimen Jonah built was brutal, unconventional, built on years of instinct rather than textbooks. Resistance work timed to the tiny signals her nervous system still sent. Painful, repetitive drills meant to wake up pathways the doctors insisted were dead. There were days Elena screamed at him to stop, days she called him every name she could think of, days she collapsed in exhaustion and told him she hated him more than she'd ever hated anyone. He never stopped showing up. On the morning she refused to get out of bed, he simply pulled up a chair and waited, sometimes for an hour, saying nothing, until her own stubbornness got the better of her and she snapped at him to get on with it already. On the days she made real progress, he never made a show of celebrating, never treated her small victories like miracles that needed applause, which somehow meant more to her than praise ever could have. He treated her the way he'd once treated wounded soldiers who needed to get back on their feet, with respect, with expectation, and with the unshakable assumption that she was capable of more than the world currently believed. Slowly, without either of them quite naming it, the sessions began to feel less like a job and more like a partnership. Elena started asking about his day. Jonah started staying past his scheduled hours without billing for the extra time. Neither of them commented on it out loud. It was a scheduling emergency, months into their strange partnership, that changed everything between them. Jonah's usual sitter fell through with less than an hour's notice, and with no other option, he arrived at the mansion with Mia in tow, apologizing before he was even through the door. Elena, expecting to be furious, instead found herself unable to look away from the small girl who marched straight up to her wheelchair without an ounce of hesitation or pity in her eyes. Is that thing fast? Mia asked, examining the chair with open curiosity. Can I sit in it? Mia, Jonah started, mortified. It's fine, Elena said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was something almost like a smile tugging at her mouth. It's not that fast, but you can look at it. Over the following hour, Mia treated Elena exactly like a person, no more, no less, asking blunt questions about the chair and her scars and whether it hurt, questions no adult had dared ask directly. There was no careful phrasing, no averted eyes, no performance of sympathy, just a child's honest curiosity. And somehow, that honesty cracked something open in Elena that all the professional gentleness in the world had failed to touch. Mia had brought a battered coloring book with her, and without asking permission, she spread it across Elena's lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, informing her matter-of-factly that grown-ups were terrible at staying inside the lines, and she would need supervision. Elena, who had not held a crayon in perhaps 3 decades, found herself laughing, actually laughing, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that startled even her. You're not very good at this, Mia announced after inspecting Elena's attempt at coloring a dragon a uniform, business-like shade of gray. I run a company, Elena said, mock offended. I don't have time to be good at everything. That's a bad excuse, Mia said, entirely unbothered by who she was talking to, and handed her a different crayon. Try purple. Dragons look better in purple. By the time Jonah packed Mia up to leave that evening, Elena found herself, unprompted, asking if they'd come again. The turning point in her recovery, when it finally came at a cost. Weeks into the intensified therapy, pushing toward the edge of what her body could handle, Elena's leg gave out during a session, and this time it wasn't fatigue. A muscle tore badly beneath the surface, and what should have been simple recovery spiraled into infection within days. She was rushed back to the hospital, fever climbing, and Dr. Whitfield arrived at her bedside with barely restrained fury. This is what happens, he told her, when unqualified people play doctor with vulnerable patients. He turned to Jonah, who stood frozen near the door. You're not licensed. You're not trained for this. If she loses that leg because of your reckless experiments, I will make sure you never work in a caregiving capacity again. He had Jonah escorted out of the hospital that night, And for 3 days, Elena lay in a bed surrounded by machines and professionals who spoke to her in soft, careful voices, and she felt more alone than she had felt since the accident itself. The fever broke on the second day, but something colder than the infection had settled into the room by then. Dr. Whitfield came by each morning with updated charts and gentle, well-meaning warnings about the dangers of false hope, about patients who chased improbable recoveries and ended up worse off for it, physically and emotionally both. He meant well. Elena could see that he meant well, and it made the whole thing harder to sit with, not easier. It would have been simpler to be angry at a villain. Instead, she was angry at a good man doing his job exactly as he'd been trained to, and underneath the anger was a colder, quieter fear that he might simply be right. Priya visited on the third night and found Elena staring at the muted television without watching it. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Priya said gently. "I already have," Elena said. "I decided the day I let him walk out that door. Now I just have to be brave enough to undo it." It was in the quiet of the third night, staring at the ceiling the way she had the night she first heard the word permanent, that Elena made her choice. She had spent her whole adult life building an empire on the strength of trusting her own judgment over everyone else's. She had let a hospital take that trust away from her the day of the accident, had let herself believe that other people's certainty about her body was more real than her own experience of it. But she remembered the twitch in her thigh. She remembered, for the first time in months, feeling like a person fighting for something instead of a patient waiting to be told what she was allowed to hope for. The next morning, she summoned every ounce of authority she'd built a company on. She signed forms overriding the hospital's objections, assumed full legal responsibility for her own care, and demanded, in the voice that used to close 9-figure deals, that Jonah be reinstated immediately. Dr. Whitfield argued. Elena didn't budge. "I have spent my whole life being the person who decides," she told him, calm and immovable. "I'm not going to stop now, in the one fight that actually matters." Jonah returned to her side within the hour, quieter than usual, uncertain of his welcome after everything that had happened. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes," Elena said. "I did." Once she'd healed enough to resume therapy, something between them had shifted, deepened. The sessions still hurt. The work was still grueling. But there was a trust now that hadn't existed before, forged in the fire of nearly losing what they'd built together. It was during one of those sessions, weeks later, both of them exhausted, sweat-soaked, pushed to the edge of what either of them thought they could survive, that old wounds finally surfaced. Jonah, gripping her leg through another agonizing repetition, found himself talking, unprompted, about the soldier he'd lost overseas, a friend he'd been unable to save despite everything he knew, the failure that had haunted him into every job he'd taken since, the reason he pushed so hard, so relentlessly, for every patient who crossed his path. Elena, stripped raw by exhaustion and the sudden intimacy of his confession, told him things she'd never told anyone, about a childhood spent proving her worth to a father who only respected results, about building a company as a shield against ever needing anyone again, about how terrified she'd been, underneath all the anger, that the accident had finally exposed her as the fragile thing she'd always secretly feared she was. And in the middle of that raw, unguarded moment, gripping the resistance band Jonah held taut against her leg, Elena felt something. A pull, deep at her thigh, that wasn't moving her. Her toes curled, faint but undeniable, entirely on their own. Jonah froze, watching her leg with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Do that again," he whispered. She did. Slower this time, more deliberate, sweat and tears mixing on her face as her body, after everything, after all of it, finally answered a command she gave it herself. "I felt that," she said, voice breaking. "Jonah, I felt that." They didn't call the doctors that night. They sat together on the floor of her exercise room, Elena's hand gripping his, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure, two people who had clawed their way back to something neither of them had believed was still possible. When Dr. Whitfield finally examined her 3 days later, running his tests with the same clinical care he always did, he sat back afterward with an expression Elena had never once seen on him, quiet astonishment. He didn't apologize, not exactly. Men who had built careers on statistical certainty rarely knew how to apologize to an outlier. But he asked, for the first time since they'd met, what exactly Jonah's methods had involved, and he listened to the answer without a trace of dismissal in his face. It wasn't victory, not the kind Elena would once have wanted, no admission of being wrong splashed across a headline. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more satisfying. Respect, earned instead of assumed. I want to document this properly, Whitfield said eventually. For other patients, if you're willing. I'm willing, Elena said. On one condition. His name goes on it too. Whitfield glanced toward Jonah, standing quietly by the window, and after a long moment, nodded. It was a small gesture, easily missed by anyone not watching closely, but Jonah understood exactly what it cost a man like Whitfield to make it, and he understood, too, that it was enough. Word of the case spread quietly through the medical community over the following weeks, not as a miracle cure, but as a data point, a single stubborn exception to a rule that had felt unbreakable. Elena didn't care about the papers or the conferences. She cared about the fact that when she woke each morning now, she woke to the possibility of movement instead of the certainty of its absence. And that possibility alone had changed the shape of every single day that followed. The months that followed were slower, steadier, filled with incremental victories that would have meant nothing to anyone watching from the outside and meant everything to the two people who had fought for every inch of them. A knee that could bear weight for 3 seconds. A leg brace exchanged for a cane. A cane exchanged, eventually, for nothing at all, just Jonah's steady arm beside her. The company Elena had built was preparing for its annual shareholder gala, an event the board had already quietly begun treating as her retirement party, certain that the CEO, who could no longer stand at a podium, had no place leading a company built on relentless momentum. Whispers had already started about her replacement. Elena arrived that night in a dress she hadn't worn in over a year, her hair done, her spine straight, seated at the edge of the ballroom in the wheelchair the board had quietly assumed would define the rest of her public life. She let them assume it, right up until her name was called to the stage. Jonah stood beside her as she gripped the handles of her chair and, with the whole room holding its breath, rose to her feet. The room went silent. Then, step by careful step, cane in one hand, Jonah steady beside her, not holding her up so much as walking beside her, Elena Voss crossed the stage on her own legs for the first time since the night of the accident. The applause that followed wasn't polite boardroom applause. It was the sound of people watching something they'd been told was impossible happen right in front of them. Board members who had spent the last month quietly interviewing her replacement now stood, chairs scraping back across the marble floor, some of them wiping their eyes without any pretense of composure. The same investors who had sent hollow get-well card a year earlier now watched with the particular shame of people realizing they had already written someone off. Elena noticed all of it, filed it away the way she used to file away underperforming numbers, and found, to her own surprise, that she felt no urge for vengeance in it. Only a quiet, settled clarity about who had actually shown up for her when it counted and who hadn't. At the podium, Elena didn't talk about quarterly earnings or growth projections. She talked about a caregiver with no formal credentials who had refused to let her give up on herself, about a little girl who had looked at her wheelchair with nothing but curiosity instead of pity, about the difference between the life she'd built to prove her worth and the one she was only now learning how to actually live. I used to think strength meant never needing anyone, she told the room. I was wrong. The strongest thing I ever did was let someone in. She found Jonah's eyes across the stage as she said it, and the smile that passed between them held nothing corporate in it at all. Later that night, on the terrace above the party, away from the noise, Elena turned to him, steadier on her feet with every week that passed, and asked the question she'd been building the courage to ask for weeks. What happens now? Well, I don't need a caregiver anymore. Jonah considered her for a long moment, something soft and certain in his expression. I guess, he said, I stick around anyway. Not for the job. For you. If you'll have us. Below them, Mia was spinning in circles on the terrace, chasing the last of the evening light, utterly unaware that she had been the one small, fearless thread that had unraveled 2 years of walls neither adult had known how to bring down alone. Elena reached for Jonah's hand, steady now in a way that had nothing to do with her legs. "Stay," she said. "Both of you. Stay." Below them, Mia had abandoned her spinning in favor of demanding, loudly, whether there would be cake at this party and whether purple dragons counted as a valid dessert theme. Jonah laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way Elena had come to treasure more than any of the applause, still echoing faintly from the ballroom below. She thought, standing there on legs that had been declared permanently lost and had somehow found their way back to her anyway, about all the versions of strength she had chased over the years. The version that meant never breaking. The version that meant never needing. She understood now that none of those versions had ever actually been strength at all, just armor built carefully over years to keep anyone from getting close enough to see her falter. Real strength, it turned out, looked like a stubborn man with no formal credentials refusing to let her give up. It looked like a 6-year-old who saw a wheelchair and asked only whether it was fast. It looked like standing on a stage in front of people who had already written her eulogy and proving, one careful step at a time, that the story wasn't over yet. And for the first time since the night the world told her everything was permanently, irreversibly lost, Elena Voss believed completely that some things were worth fighting to get back.